So first, I just want to welcome everyone to today's webinar on intercept surveys. Make sure, okay, I am recording. I didn't see my little recording notice come up. This is a part of our ongoing series on downtown revitalization for the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky. My name is Shane Barton. I'm our Downtown Revitalization Coordinator. And today we're really going to focus on intercept surveys. We're going to talk about determining the return on investment for projects that are really focused on generating foot traffic and increased retail spending. So we're going to touch on some survey methods. We're going to touch on the research methods. We're going to touch on developing questions, different types of questions to avoid. And then I'm going to also, at the end of the presentation, talk through some different scenarios and how we may want to plan the logistics for those types of events that are fairly common in the region. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in. And like I mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to share those in the chat and I will circle back to them at the end of the presentation. So what we're really talking about is both a tool and a process. And this really supports the evaluation, like I said, of those sorts of projects where we have increased foot traffic or retail spending. I would suggest that this should not be a standalone effort, but really should be a part of your larger evaluation process to really look at if you are accomplishing the goals for your downtown revitalization or other projects that you have in mind. So the reason that we do this sort of effort, and in particular with intercept surveys, is we want the numbers, we want the data. And I always share that this sort of data can really provide some compelling explanations for what's going on in terms of economic impact. It'll often help uncover new questions that we may not have asked ourselves. Oftentimes communities use it to justify what they're investing in or seeking future funding allocations. So really, we're talking about this broad economic impact, but also learning the who, what, when, and why folks are in our communities. So like I mentioned, this process and tool can really help us explain what's going on. For example, if we're applying for a grant to do a downtown improvement project, one thing that could really sort of bolster that application, if we're already able to provide the economic impact that we have experienced with pedestrians already, or if we can relate to other efforts, maybe a downtown festival, where we can do this sort of research and know exactly what folks are spending and the particular impacts they're making. Having that number and that data to be able to include in your grant proposals, I guarantee will make you a stronger candidate for whatever grant you're applying for. But oftentimes, this sort of information may contradict or help us contradict what we may know. For instance, we may think that a festival has a substantial impact because we've estimated the number of people, or we've estimated sort of what they may have spent. But until we really ask and get this really quantitative data, it may be hard for us to truly justify the numbers that we hypothesize. So I would say that it allows us to not only test what we may think to be true, but it may also confront some of the things that we need to learn or ask about in the future. So again, components of downtown revitalization that are really appropriate for this type of effort, we're talking efforts to increase pedestrians, folks walking around your downtown, or trail users if you have a trail, event and festivals, whether we're talking downtown events or an event or festival, perhaps not downtown at another location. And really, we're getting to the retail and economic impacts of those visitors, pedestrians, or attendees to those festivals. In almost every community, we have some type of event that we don't know the true economic impact on. And most folks that have worked with me long enough, when we talk about pedestrians, often hear me say that we really believe that pedestrians are the indicator species of a healthy downtown. And the more people you see circulating and walking, most likely the healthier your community is. So let's jump into, what is data and what types of data are we going to try to get at here? Well, really, we're talking primary data because we're going to be collecting it. Typically, this type of collection does require a little bit more in terms of your commitment, either resources or time. There's a little bit more control on your part because you're going to be dictating the question sets and doing the analysis. The reliability is much greater on this because you're actually collecting the data and you can replicate it. And really often these sorts of efforts are done with surveys or focus groups or even one-on-one interviews. Secondary data is the type of data that you can find. For instance, if you're looking for research on a number of dollars that a particular or a very general tourist spends, you may be able to find research that suggests a tourist doing this particular activity typically spends this much money, and you can use that number to estimate an impact. That's really using secondary data. So it's really a good guess, and I wouldn't say don't do that, but I would say that it may not give you this very specific numbers that you're looking for. Now, in terms of the data that we're going to be collecting, we're really talking about both quantitative and qualitative. And I know this may sound like a research methods 101, but this stuff is really important as we start to really construct the survey to have a good understanding of what we're trying to gather. Quantitative are numbers. It's the numeric values. We may be able to get insight on sort of the comprehension or knowledge or opinions of someone. We can have them classify or stratify, do they agree or strongly agree or disagree? We can measure these and we can do some really interesting statistical analysis. Often these numbers allow us to do a really good generalization of the whole population. And I'll get to that in a minute, that we're not going to be, we're not attempting to survey everyone. We're going to be targeting a sample within that population of folks, either on the street as a pedestrian or at a festival or event. Qualitative data really refers to the narrative. So this would be when we ask someone to explain something or provide their opinion, some text. Often with an Intercept survey, we may ask them, what was your favorite part of the festival? Or what was your most memorable moment while attending the festival? One thing to note about qualitative data is that it does often complicate the analysis. It takes a couple more steps. It's not just simple summary of data points and doing some statistical analysis, but we'll get into some of that in a moment. So survey research really is one of the best ways to get really targeted feedback. It's one of the most common methods to collect primary data, and it allows us to ask the most important questions to answer the questions that we have. But like I said before, there may be other ways to answer your question. And I would invite you to explore those as well. And if possible, perhaps do both and combine what you find to compare, to see if what you think you're learning really does jive with what you found in the secondary data. So let's get into what an intercept survey is. So really what we're talking about here is literally intercepting, approaching people who are engaged in a specific activity. And these may be, like I said, festival attendees or trail users for the two examples we're going to focus on today. I've mentioned this before, but we're not really talking about a research method and a tool, but they're really both. Neither can stand alone. And the reason that I say that is that it has to be paired with something. And in particular, in this case, what this intercept survey has to be paired with is a crowd count. We have to know sort of what our total population is of attendees to that festival. And you may be thinking in your mind right now, well, how do we count everyone? Well, I'll get to that in just a moment. And I'll show you some quick ways and some simple ways that you may be able to organize those logistics when you decide to do an intercept survey. So as you're getting started, it's important to begin with the end in mind. and to start thinking about, what do I want to know, or what do I want to be able to show or communicate? Who is my source of data? Who am I going to be asking the questions to? Who's going to be seeing the results? How am I going to communicate those? Who's going to do the analysis, and how do I want to handle that? So I often suggest, before folks just start creating a survey, really to try to go through these questions and think about how they want to approach not just the survey document, but organizing how they're going to accomplish sort of approaching people, collecting data, and all of that. Because really there's a linear process here that I'd like to outline for you. And this is sort of typical of survey research, including the Intercept survey. So first, you want to ask yourself, what question am I trying to answer? And in my opinion, maybe what we want to answer is, where are people coming from to our festival? How much are people spending at our festival? And what do they really enjoy about the event? Those come to mind fairly easily for me. So then we want to think about, how do we get our sample? Who are the folks that we really want to ask these questions to, and how are we going to get this data from them? How are we going to create the survey? What questions are going to be on the survey that we ask? How do we want to approach the folks and have them fill out the survey? How are we going to clean it or record that data? Are we going to write it on paper? Are we going to have them do a web version? How are we going to download that data or input it into Excel spreadsheets or a database that we can then analyze? And then, does that analysis really answer the question that we asked ourselves? Do we know what we're trying to answer? Probably the most important is, how are we going to communicate the results? Who are we going to share them with? How are we going to celebrate the impact that a particular event may have had on our community's economics? And then repeat and refine as needed. So as we're conceptualizing this, and as we're sort of thinking about the questions, or our research question, if you will, consider the following categories. Do you want to ask about folks' attitudes or opinions, their feelings about things, their behaviors, what they do, what they spend, or their demographics, who they are, where they're from? And then start to create that list of questions and consider how you're going to measure it. And what I would recommend is try to get at least one questionnaire question for each variable that you're trying to answer. And I'll show you some example Intercept surveys that I can highlight some of this with you. So in terms of the population and the sample, the population are all the people that are going to be in that festival grounds or on the street. The sample are the folks that we're actually going to ask to do the survey. Most folks and most organizations and communities have limited time, resources, budgets, volunteers, and the thought of trying to survey every single pedestrian or every single festival attendee may be a little far-fetched. It may be a little too big of a bite to take. So that's really why in this sort of research, we recommend, thinking about the sample, getting those folks that are coming into the festival grounds in a repeatable way that you can replicate. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I go to the scenarios and the logistics. But like I said, the population really represents that whole group of people that you're interested in knowing about. And the sample is the representative population that we're going to actually ask the question to provide some inference to the population activity or their behaviors. And you'll see me using this P and this S a little bit later in some images. And the golden rule here really is we want a randomly selected sample. A simple random sample gives everyone in that population an equal chance to be asked. And that's where we can replicate it. The other option is a stratified random sample, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend for an Intercept survey, but this is where you would break those samples into subpopulations, whether it's, income brackets or other demographics or communities or zip codes. And you can do some of that analysis afterwards, once you have the data, But getting that simple random sample is fairly important here because it gives us an opportunity to infer on the population. Now, how do we get a simple random sample of people coming into an event? Well, one thing is we use kind of a random number. And what I would recommend is selecting a number between 1 and 10, for example. And say you select 7, lucky number 7. What you would then do is, as folks are coming into your festival grounds or coming into your event, you would want to sample every 7th person. And what I mean by that is you would want to approach them with the Intercept survey and have them complete it. And then every 7th person that comes through, your volunteers should perhaps survey that person. And as you can imagine, depending on the size of your event and how many attendees you have, that may dictate how many volunteers or the capacity that's going to be required on your end to be able to actually sample that population. So, and I'll again go into some other scenarios and logistics of how to organize that just a little bit later. So when we're actually developing this survey, when we're developing the questionnaire, let's think about what questions we want to answer. What do we want to ask folks? What do we want to know? Then we need to determine how are we actually going to administer this. Is it going to be electronic? Are we going to email? No, we're not doing any of that. Most of this, and we're talking about an Intercept survey, is really in person. Okay. And then we want to really get into the form of the question, because research questions, if not written correctly, can create some pitfalls for us and may not actually give us the data that we want. So I'm going to talk through some questions that are appropriate to ask, and then some questions that you want to be cautious about. One thing that I will remind you is try to keep it as short as possible. I'm not saying this to say collect less data, but what I'm really saying is be very intuitive about the questions that you are asking, that you're asking the ones that matter the most, because there's only a limited number of space on a page. And you also want to be cognizant of how much time you're asking of the folks as they're trying to get to something that they really want to attend to. The last thing you want to do is be the barrier between someone and some fun, because they'll just sort of, they'll just not want to talk to you at all. So let's think about, when we're asking these questions, we really want to make sure we're getting back to what we're trying to get insight on, and that's that research question. Or am I asking this in a useful way? You may want to ask yourself, is the question clear? And do I have any problematic questions or leading or loaded questions? And I'll share some examples. For instance, you wouldn't want to ask, do you support faster speed limits to reduce commute times? Because this is making some inferences about if we could just drive faster, we'd get to work quicker, when that may not necessarily be the case. So I'll share some other problematic questions that you'll want to avoid. So here are some different structures of questions to consider. There are unstructured, open-ended verbal questions. Again, these are really terrible for analysis. They take a lot of time. You may have to code the responses into themes of what people recommend or suggest. You may have to create some sort of word count. This thing is mentioned so many times in positive light or negative light. So just be cautious when you're asking open-ended questions. I would limit those to the ones that are absolutely necessary. Your structured numeric questions are great for analysis because you have a number to work with. So this would be, how many years of education do you have? Or how much did you spend on gas getting here would be another example. Multiple choice questions are okay. They're okay to use. Where did you shop? And then maybe there's a list of multiple choices. And you can either select the one that matters, or you can use those sorts of questions to check all that apply. And then when we're getting into categorical or ranking, you may want to use a scale from, highly agree to highly disagree, or some sort of ranking where someone would rank, my favorite things are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'll share some other examples related to this in just a moment. So let's talk through different types of questions you can ask. There are the yes, no questions. And this is really when you want to force one answer or the other. And this would be, would you attend this festival or would you attend this event again? That's a yes or no question. There's not a lot of black or white there. Don't use these if there are a range of responses that you could anticipate from someone taking the survey. But if you do want a range, or if you want them to explain, this may not be the appropriate question type to ask. There are single response questions, which are a little different than yes or no. But again, we're trying to force a single response that we can use to analyze. And this would be something like, what is your class year if you were surveying students? Or what's the most important facet to improve the rec center? Or why didn't you talk to the mayor about your concern? That question is not one that you want to go for, because it may elude more than a single response. So just be cautious when you're putting these questions together. And again, I'm going to show you a couple examples so you can see how we've structured some of these questions. And if you have any questions, please feel free to share those in the chat, and we'll get back to them momentarily. There are the multiple response. So, again, those check all that apply or select your top 3 or top 5. This is really when there's a number of responses. So how did you hear about the Downtown Festival? This may be online or newspaper, from a friend, I got an email, those sorts of responses. Use these when you want to limit the number and you want folks to have to prioritize within a group. So what are your primary reasons for attending? Are you hoping to have fun, hang out with friends, spend some money, those sorts of things. But do not use, if it's important for respondents to only be associated with one. So, a multiple response wouldn't be appropriate for age. You may not want to put a bunch of responses for your age. It would be easier for them just to put a single response. We only have one age. In terms of ranking, whether we're using a Likert scale from most important to least important, or what have you, these are also great to use. Many of us have seen these on surveys, but I will caution you that the analysis and the interpretation of these sorts of rankings can be a little more difficult. You really have to be a little bit more cautious, because you're not using a raw number as you're doing that analysis to get a sum. You can assign the number 1 through 5 and do an average. Would be one way to sort of make it a numeric value when you report it. But I just want to caution you that it does require a little additional maneuvering when you're doing the analysis. It's not just a simple number. Similar with scales. Scales are kind of like ranking in a way, and you want to use these when you when you want to capture sort of from a range of responses. How satisfied were you with the meeting, or how satisfied were you with the event? Do not use these if it's a yes or no. Would you come back to the event? Highly agree, strongly agree, probably not the most appropriate. Or if you're asking about a particular demographic, scales wouldn't be appropriate. It would be that yes or no, or a numeric value there. So when we're thinking about pitfalls to avoid, I know this can sound complicated, creating these questions and the pressure of getting them right and getting them easy for respondents to read. But here are some general pitfalls that I would recommend we try to avoid. In particular, those related to what we would call socially desirable responses. So anything that sort of confronts social norms, whether it's race, whether it's drug or alcohol use, sexual activity, or other topics that are considered sensitive to some, you may want to avoid those questions. Leading questions are one where you may be suggesting inadvertently the correct response. So an example would be, why would it be good to eliminate jaywalking on campus? By putting in that, why would it be good, it's leading that respondent to assume that ending jaywalking would be great for campus. Now, It very well may be, but there may be other reasons for why people jaywalk that we need to explore. The double-barreled questions, you've probably heard that before, are those questions that ask two simultaneous questions. You want to avoid that as well. So an example would be, what are the strengths and weaknesses of orientation? Or what are the strengths and weaknesses of the event? I would suggest separating those to get two distinct responses if you could. The double negatives, including any kind of negative phrasing in your survey questions, is a no-no. So if you had, say, a series where do you agree or disagree with the following statements, you wouldn't want to have a question, I do not feel welcome in downtown. Try to avoid any kind of negative words in your questions. In particular, what I mean by negative are the no's, the don'ts, those sorts of specific words. Demographics, asking these, while they shouldn't feel sensitive, I will admit that many organizers who are doing this and also respondents to surveys sometimes do feel like these demographic questions are a little intrusive. Whether we're asking someone's age or their income or income bracket, their ethnicity or their sexual orientation or their male or female gender or how they identify, those can be very sensitive to folks. So I would caution you to ask yourself if you really need to ask those questions on the Intercept survey. And if you do, try to make them as less intrusive as possible. The other golden rule for most surveys is to try to put them at the end. What I will say in an Intercept survey is there really is no beginning and end. We try to keep it on a very small, like half a sheet of paper or one sheet of paper at the most. So again, there's not a lot of real estate to work with. So ask yourself if you really need to add those questions to your Intercept survey. So when we're collecting data, there's really a process here. One, we've noted that we need to count the population. And we need to select that sample. So, counting the population would literally require a volunteer or a series of volunteers with a little hand counter or some other note tally or what have you, literally counting how many people walk past. And what we often recommend is wherever you're set up, and this will make a little bit more sense in a moment, but create a line from you to a point. And you will want to count every person that walks past that point, and that will be your population. Now, if we were still using that 7 as our random number of how we were going to do our sample, we would then approach every 7th person that passes over that line. So one person's going to be approaching every 7th, while the other person is counting the population. Okay. Now, what does it look like when we're actually doing it? Well, the first part is approaching the person that you're hoping to sample. This can feel very awkward for some people who aren't comfortable just sort of talking to strangers. But what I would recommend here is to try to be as polite and friendly, even overly friendly, a big smile if possible, that welcoming behavior. You don't want to scare folks off as you approach them. So typically for me, this would involve a big smile, hey, do you have a minute? Welcome to the festival. My name is Shane Barton. This is the identifying portion. My name's Shane Barton. I'm doing a quick survey to learn how all of our festival attendees are enjoying themselves, but also the economic impact that we're creating. I would recommend a script at this point where you will do the introduction to the survey. You want this to be consistent. So when you're describing what you're doing or what you hope to learn, and in particular, if it's going to take 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, you want to be upfront. So again, smiling, hey, everybody, hey, how you doing? Welcome to the festival. My name is Shane Barton. I'm with the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky. We're conducting a survey today. We want to learn more about the impact that you're having on our community and how much you really enjoy the festival to help us learn how we can both improve what we're doing here in town, but also make this experience better for you. This survey is going to take you at least 3 minutes, maybe 5, no more than 6. Would you be willing to participate, to share your thoughts? Make sure you ask permission before you start shoving things in people's faces or put that clipboard in their face. Once they say, yeah, I'd love to, or no, get away from me, then walk away and approach the next 7th person. You'll then want to administer that however you have chosen. Okay. So in terms of administering the survey, there's really a couple different ways. We're either going to do a paper where we're going to hand it to them, we're going to be face-to-face, or we're going to use some sort of mobile application or technology, maybe an iPad or a tablet of some sort, or a laptop. But I think given sort of where we are in the times of COVID, there's probably a hybrid of both, where we can create and use technology, but also do it in a face-to-face way. So let's think about what are the pros and cons here as we're trying to decide what to use. Obviously, when we're doing a web or mobile application, you as an organization you don't have to worry about data entry, because the person actually filling out the survey is going to be putting that in there, and you're going to be downloading it. This makes accuracy a little better because it takes out any sort of mistypes or miscues when you're transferring data from a paper version. Now, in terms of face-to-face, it's great to have that captive audience when you can approach someone and actually administer it to them one-on-one. When you're using that paper, you don't need the internet. And considering that many of us are working in or represent rural communities that may have limited internet capacity, that may be important to acknowledge. If your iPad or phone would even be able to access your SurveyMonkey, for example. So again, be thoughtful in how you actually decide to collect your data, and whether you decide to use an online platform to have them fill out, or whether you use a paper form. Either way, what I will recommend, especially in these moments that we're living in today, is that to be very careful and cautious. And in particular, if you're approaching people at a festival, you may want to wear a mask or a face covering. To do that, you may want to maintain social distance, and you may want to consult with your health department, your local health department, on how you could best approach this and seek their insight. We're living in strange times, which is why I suggest there may be a good hybrid model here to use both, to sort of check off the most positive aspects of both methods here. So once you've got your survey and you've thought about how you're going to deploy it, test that sucker. Ask your friends to take it. Give it to your colleagues. Bring your team together and do a focus group. Do the questions relate to what you're trying to answer? Are the questions clear? Are you using vocabulary, or are you using jargon, right? We all fall into this. I fall into this trap of using sort of a language of my profession, but I then realized that maybe the entire population doesn't know what a wayfinding sign is, or what some other term that I often may use is. So be very careful about your vocabulary. So we've long awaited. Here is an example of an Intercept survey that was created by our team in conjunction with Extension. This sample survey has been adapted by other communities. So you can see it's really short and simple and sweet, and it's very quick to do in terms of administering. We often recommend that you print this maybe 2 to a page and cut it in half. You will note one of the first questions is income level. When I have often shared this one, that is typically the first question that gets culled because of folks' sensitivities to asking people how much money they make, and their worries about folks just denying doing the survey when they see that question. So here we ask, what's your primary reason for being in the area? Where are you staying? How did you hear about the event? What was your highlight? What was one thing you would change? And then a series of kind of bracketed money questions, expenditure questions. How much did you spend on gas or food festival vendors, those sorts of things. Now, you may be asking yourself, why didn't you just ask them how much they spent instead of giving them ranges? What I will say is that people can go through this and answer these questions much faster than if they have to think about every expenditure they made and calculate that in their head. What you're going to have is you're going to have a lot of thinking that's going to really sort of delay that process. But I would recommend using this sort of question set if possible. But if you feel like you want to test that to see if folks can give you a specific amount, feel free to ask. But we've had good success with this version. I'm going to show you another example here. This is an adapted version from the previous one that a community has used. You'll see some very similar questions. What you'll note is the font is a little larger. It's a little more spread out. We took the income question out and provided a little more space for the narrative questions related to the highlight of the group and the one thing that they would change. So you can see it gets to similar questions. It looks a little different. It's kind of cleaned up a little bit and a little easier on the eye. But I wanted to share just a couple examples of surveys that we have used and have helped other communities use in the past. So let's go through a quick checklist here. First thing you need is you need your team. You've probably heard this as I've been explaining this. This is going to be really hard for one person to do. It's going to take a team effort. You're going to need some volunteers. You're going to need some folks committed to helping you with this the day of the event. You're going to need to think about that research question and create that survey and make sure your survey questions get back to your research question. You need a site strategy. How are you actually going to capture that sample and count your population? What materials do you need? Do I need a bunch of paper, pencils, clipboards, face masks? Do I need alcohol wipes, Lysol spray, iPads, and the such? What materials do you need to do that? You need to plan to count that sample and count that population. And then you need to, one thing I didn't add in here in this analysis is also data entry. If you decide to do paper versions, data entry is sort of the precursor to the analysis. And then once you do that analysis, you've got to be prepared to communicate your results. Write that op-ed, write that piece in the newspaper celebrating how successful your event was. Put those numbers in there. Make the success of your event undeniable. And if you've got the numbers and the method to back it up, you can qualify your statements. So let's talk scenarios, right? So you may have noticed up here, I've got my festival grounds marked with the pen. So we're going to jump into some scenarios here and sort of talk through what this would look like. So this is a festival ground. You can see the little stage over there. Our population is in the middle. This is an example if we have one way in and one way out. Our population is contained within the festival grounds, if you will. And that green area is where we're going to count our sample. We would want to count everyone coming in as the population. And then we would say, we'll go back to that number 7. We would want to intercept and survey every 7th person that crosses that threshold of this entryway. But you may be saying, my festival has way more than one way to come into it. Well, here's an example where maybe we have 2, and you could also add a 3rd. But again, everyone inside that represents your population that we're trying to infer about. And the green areas, those entryways, are where we're going to capture our sample. What I would recommend is you want to count and capture as people come in, not necessarily as they go out in this scenario, because you may have someone come in on the left and go out on the right. So keep it consistent. And at the end of the day, what you would do is you would compare your counts from each side that are coming in to create your total population count, and then compile those surveys and do the analysis that way. But you may also be saying, wait a second, this is assuming we have a festival ground. Our festivals are downtown. What do we do? So in this scenario, this is sort of what I would call the wild open scenario, where everyone is descending on your event from a lot of directions. This may be difficult to do because you can see that our population is in the middle. If we were to use every sort of threshold here, we're going to need a lot of volunteers and a lot of materials to help us do these surveys, right? So what I would suggest in this case is I would sort of move our thresholds where our volunteers are established, maybe to the green dots, where we can capture and funnel those people through. And that now becomes the threshold for what we will count our population. And then we will count, say, to 7 or to 5, that sample. Again, the population is everyone sort of in the middle there. One other option that you may have, if you've got a great relationship maybe with Public Works, or if the local government can collaborate, this may not be possible to shut down streets, if you will, if you have a state route or an alley that needs to remain open. But what I've recommended here is maybe closing pedestrian access to a couple of those and trying to funnel them in, so that then it limits how many people you have to actually survey or get to that data point. And now I completely understand if you're just doing the survey sort of for an organization that may not be a part of it, you may not be able to advocate or sway an opinion around what streets to close. But I wanted to provide a couple different examples of how you may want to approach different scenarios that often we'll face in our smaller communities. The other type of downtown survey, or excuse me, downtown event we may have is one on a downtown square. You know, we have a number of communities that have kind of a traditional square where the population's in the middle. And again, it's kind of a free for all. You're going to have people coming in, and those samples and going to be really hard to count. You may be tempted to get in the middle and create a little whirlwind and just try to approach every person you can. Please don't do that, because what will happen is that your own internal bias that you may not even be aware of will come out in the data. You may in your mind only approach the people that you feel comfortable with, or that look approachable, or what have you. What I would recommend is to be a little more thoughtful here. Try to maybe close down access or funnel people, or again, strategize around where you create that threshold. If you've got corner streets coming together, maybe you do a diagonal and have a volunteer team on each side to help count, and to help count those not only the population, but to get that sample as well. Okay. So those are some samples or examples for a downtown type event or a festival. But I also said this could be great for a trail. Again, the population of trail users here are all the people on the trail. Now, some trails may be 8 to 5 or sun up to sundown. Some trails may be 24/7. So that population may change depending on your trail. What I would recommend here, because you're not going to be able to stand out there on the trail constantly to count how many users you have, there has been great success using infrared counters or even game cameras that you can set up to do your population count. So what I would recommend here is to set a date. If you establish these trail cameras or infrared counters, capture that data. And then what you'll want to do, in particular with infrared cameras, is you'll want to have an observation day where you go test the number. Some of these cameras have a hard time counting groups, and it may count a group together as one person or two people, depending on the size. So with this sort of technology, you'll want to schedule a day where you actually go and test that number. You'll want to set a timeline. You'll want to observe how many people. You'll want to physically count them with a little counter, and then divide that number by the number that your infrared counter did, and you'll start to get a sense of a coefficient that you may have to use to estimate your population if you're using a counter like this. Now, if you're using a game camera, you may have to look at every picture and count those parties that are using your trail. But the sample for instance, you may have to go to a trailhead or that threshold where people are going to be crossing or entering that area. And you'll want to schedule those times, be consistent. Again, you'll want to set that number for your sample. You know, do I want to survey every third person on a Saturday from 10 to 6, or do I want to survey every seventh person? And then again, you'll want to have your survey question, and all of the small details that we talked about moments ago. Okay. So now that you have all of that, you've done your analysis, you have your results. Really what's important here is you need to report your results and make sure that when you're reporting these, just use statistics. Be careful with any kind of leading words, flamboyant adjectives, or exaggerated conditions or conclusions. Give me the facts. Just give me the facts. And if you speculate, make sure the readers know that you're speculating when you communicate your analysis. So at the end, did you answer your research question? Do I know from that process who come to my event, what they liked or what they didn't like, and maybe even more importantly, how much did they spend while they were here? Are there any other questions that come up? And are there other implications? Are there policies or practices or other recommendations that may come out of this effort? And lastly, here in big gold bolded font and print, communicate the results. It does no one any good for you to invest your time in gathering this data if you can't celebrate the success of that event that you're trying to get these insights on. So communicate, communicate, communicate. Let people know how successful your investments and your events are in your communities. Shoo, all right, we did it. That was very quick. I appreciate you all sitting through that. I'm going to unshare my screen so I can see everyone, and we're going to just jump into some questions if we have them. All right. Are there any questions?
Hey, Shane, it's Ruthie Caldwell. Yeah, I really loved your examples of the surveys. Like, do you have any more of those you could share, like that checklist? I love that checklist too.
I can share. I got a message that I was hard to read. I wish I had seen that. I got a little fan on here beside me. My air conditioning is out in my home and it's a little warm. I have the examples that I shared. I could probably, I'm sure we could get together and we could talk through it. Or I could also reach out to Simona, our research director, and pick her brain a little bit. At CEDIK, we do have a wonderful, very extensive research team that supports a lot of the kind of behind the scenes stuff that you'll see us publish. And they are more than welcome to support communities in developing this sort of stuff. So what I guess the best answer is, I don't have any on deck that I could send you this afternoon, but we can make it happen, Ruthie, if there are particular questions that we're interested in getting at.
I guess another thing would be like if you had like some sort of like 1-page tip sheet of like what to include about questions. I'm always so worried that my questions might be leading and I might not know it. Like if there were just a few questions of like, did you do this in your question? Or like, you know, like that would help me make better questions, I think.
Okay. I will see if we can maybe pull something like that together for you. And if so, I'll see if I can maybe add it to this somehow when we do the video. If not, I'll make sure to make it available.
That'd be amazing. Thank you.
I'm with you, Ruthie. I'm no research expert. I can muddle through it when I need to with the help of my friends. And I always sort of share those with other folks because I don't always trust myself. That's why it's really great to have another group of people with some insight, either do it as a focus group or provide feedback or comment like that.
Great. Well, this was super helpful. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yes, Sarah.
Shane, I wanted to suggest too, not to completely write off electronic methods of collecting data if you don't have Wi-Fi access. There are some programs that will allow you to work offline and collecting information and then upload it. So, you know, I think one of the barriers to this can be just the amount of time it takes sometimes to input all this information if you've collected it on paper. So yeah, maybe that's something we can also include in that one pager or that handout we might put together is some ideas about online resources for that.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. I'm obviously also not a technical expert, but I have gotten myself in trouble when I felt like I needed Wi-Fi and couldn't get it. So if you are planning on using one of these systems, let us know, and we'll, like I said, or like Sarah said, we'll do a little research on it as well. But if you do decide to use this in your community, let us know. And let us be an avenue of your communication. So if you go home and decide to do this, let us know. I'd be more than willing to write a little blog post or put a little social media piece about how your community was able to do this and what you learned about the impact that your festival had on your local economics. Yeah, Clay.
So just thinking about this, we have like the Mountain Heritage Festival coming up soon. We're doing a tourism booth for that. Is there a suggested time that you would want to get people's opinion? Like, is it better to get them while they're coming in the door? Is it better to get them when they're leaving? Is it better because, you know, are they just trying to get in and see the festival and you're aggravating them? Or when they're leaving, are they tired and just don't want to really talk to anybody? They're just trying to get out of there. Like, is there a better suggestion on when and where to hit people up for this information?
Clay, I'll be honest and say I wish there was, because people are as diverse as you just described them. There are going to be some people that aren't going to want to be even stopped. They want to get in and hear the music. Especially, I can imagine at your all's Levitt Amp, if you had gotten in front of me as I was headed to the Kentucky Headhunters, I may just juke you and sidestep you to go find my seat. Right? So I think it's really sort of on a case-by-case basis. What I would recommend is maybe if you have multiple places where people are coming out, maybe you want to add the piece where you get one side coming in and you survey the other folks leaving, or maybe you do both. And if the person says, "I've already answered the survey," you say, "Thank you." You know, what I shared isn't the definitive rule. This stuff is really more theoretical, what I was presenting, and you'd most certainly have the freedom to kind of curate that process as best as you can. One suggestion that I would have, though, knowing that, you know, most tourism commissions or organizations typically will have a table or a booth set up, I wouldn't recommend just having it at your booth for people to fill out when they come up to talk to you. Because you're not really going to get a good relative sample of that population. But that's really why that intercept piece, getting them either coming or going, is important. And you're totally right. How would someone be able to provide inference on a question like, what was your favorite part of the event, if they haven't been to the event yet? So great question. What it does is it makes us ask even more questions, really. So I do apologize about that.
So one of the questions on there is if it's this event, like our event is a week-long event, one of those questions you can add on there is how many days are you attending the event? Is it just the weekend? Did you come here for a week-long stay? Like, you know, how long are you in the community as well? I think would be something good to add to that. Yeah,
I think that would be a great question, especially for an event with 3 days or 5 days. You know, you imagine how you would do this at a county fair, right? Where it's going all week, and maybe you just do the concerts in the evening. And again, you have to balance this with the volunteer capacity you have. And it may be that you just go on the headliner night, you know, as opposed to going on the Tuesday night or the Wednesday night. So, you know, there's some flexibility here on how you approach it. Are there any other questions? Nope. Hearing none. Going once. Going twice. 3 times sold. Kitty, I know you've got a question.
No, I really don't. It was good. I guess my only question is, can I steal some of your stuff?
What do you want to steal, Kitty?
I like those diagrams and stuff, you know.
I can share this with you, and I will. If you need the presentation, I'll share those slides with you. I got to the end when I was creating this, realized that I needed some scenarios to really talk through, because I was like, this is going to be hard for folks to sort of ground truth it in their heads when they're thinking about their own festival. So I got on Canva, a graphic sort of design suite
yeah.
that we use. And I just went wild one night creating, and there's a bunch of them that I didn't use, but I just started creating images that was like, this is kind of like a downtown festival I'm familiar with. This is kind of like an offsite festival I'm familiar with.
Well, I thought it was really good, the visual part, because, of course, with Main Streets, they try and access surveys of different kinds of things, not just events, but, maybe Small Business Saturday, but not realizing you got to cut off those entrance points, or at least have someone there.
Yeah.
And I think they, so many people try to just kind of walk through the crowd, figure out who to ask questions to, and you really don't know what your population was.
No.
And they look at those drone pictures or whatever, and they try to, like New York, there's 10 people in a square, and how many did we get? And yeah. So those were good.
Yeah, I would highly recommend not to do the kind of like Tasmanian devil, get in the crowd and just ask everybody, because even if you don't acknowledge your bias will come out.
Absolutely.
You will approach people who you're comfortable with, or look like you, or are wearing something that you're comfortable with, and you'll never be able to repeat it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really good. You just say every seventh person, and that's who you ask, regardless.
Or whatever number.
Or 5 or whatever. Yeah.
7 is my lucky number. You don't have to choose my lucky number.
My brother's baseball number, so we might go with that.
There you go. Well, if there are no other questions, we have reached 3 p.m. And that is the extent of the commitment that I ask you. I want to thank you all so very much for joining us today. We will be getting this ready. We have the recording. And then I will make sure to follow up with everyone that registered via email. I'll share the recording with you. And then we'll be getting that recording out on our sort of social media chains. And remember, communicate, communicate, communicate. If you do decide to do this, let me know. If you want me to take a look at your survey, shoot me an email. I would love to be there involved, maybe not there in person. I may not have the time, but I'd love to be there mentally involved with you. And I would love to be able to promote and help communicate your effort and commitment to learning what your events are doing in your communities. So again, thank you all so very much for joining us. It has been my pleasure. You have another question, Kitty?
I do.
Okay.
And it's basically just for you. Would you be willing to do this training for the Main Street directors?
I could do that.
Mm-hmm. Because I think, hearing it from you and having all the information to how you create questions, how you do stuff, I think would be very advantageous. They listen to me a lot, so having guest speakers is always good. Yeah.
I love being a guest speaker. So,
okay.
So yes, Kitty, I would be willing to do that.
Okay.
You all,
I'll be in touch. All right.
Be in touch.
Thank you.
Allie, thank you for joining us. Scott and Karen, thank you for joining us. If y'all have any other questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Have a great day.
Stay cool.
Bye-bye.